Greetings. Welcome to the MLaw A3 Reunions panel discussion on transactional practitioners as unsung heroes of equity and empowerment. I have the humble duty of introducing our panel, and then I'll follow up with a little introduction of myself. But I'll start right out the gate with Mr. Osahan Akunde. Osahan is Michigan Law class of 2017, is a writer and associate in the Structured Finance Department at CadMutual. He has worked on both public and private placement securitizations, as well as asset-backed loans. Osahan has worked to integrate his appreciation of U.S. history into the understanding of corporate law, which is a very important thing. It's one of the things that lets you know right off the bat he's going to be an interesting contributor to this discussion. Thank you, Osahan, for participating. Next up is Professor Dana Thompson, the Michigan Law's very own. Professor Thompson is Michigan class of 99, is a clinical professor of law and directs Michigan Law's Transactional Law Clinics program, the Community Enterprise Clinic, and the Entrepreneurship Clinic, of which she is the founding director. She has devoted most of her legal career to representing community-based organizations and small businesses in transactional matters to advance racial, economic, and social justice in urban communities. Prior to entering academia, Professor Thompson practiced at Morrison & Foerster in San Francisco, then at Miller Starr, where she specialized in commercial real estate and corporate law. She then joined the Nature Conservancy as a regional counsel. Professor Thompson is also a statewide elected member of the Wayne State University Board of Governors. Thank you, Professor Thompson, for joining this discussion. Next up is David Baker Lewis. David is Michigan Law class of 70, now retired, served as chairman and the chief executive officer of the law firm of Lewis and Monday in Detroit, Michigan, which was established in 1972. With more than 4 decades of experience in municipal finance, David is respected as an expert in municipal bonds. As co-founder of Lewis and Monday, David led the firm to become the first minority-owned law firm listed in the bond buyers directory, municipal bond dealers, the Red Book, and that is a huge deal for anybody watching on that. That's the type of thing that is an impossibility, and we'll talk more through our discussion. You kind of get a feel for that. The firm is nationally recognized as a multi-state bond counsel firm in the United States. The firm's practice also includes litigation, real estate, employment, and corporate law. David is an alumnus of Oakland University and the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Thank you, David, for joining this panel discussion. And I myself, Travis Townsend Jr., I'm Michigan Law class of 2003. I'm a founding partner at Townsend and Lockett in Atlanta, Georgia, and I lead our business and transactional practices. My practice consists primarily of corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions, and institutional finance through secured lending. I'm also an adjunct professor at the Emory School of Law, where I teach deal skills, doing deals. Before I co-founded Townsend and Lockett, I was a senior associate at Womble Carlisle, Sandridge and Rice here in Georgia, and I practiced at Morris, Manning and Martin before that, after beginning my career at Alston and Bird. And it is a humble honor to serve as the moderator of this distinguished group in this very important discussion. And so just a quick overview before we get into the conversation. Why are we talking about transactional practitioners as unsung heroes of equity and empowerment? Quite frankly, when people think about lawyers who are trying to push the envelope in civic change or in equity or in empowerment, particularly in the Black community, they don't necessarily think right of transactional practitioners. You usually think of litigators. Indeed, some of our most recognized advances in that space come from landmark cases. You think of Brown versus Board of Education. But there is a lot to be said about practitioners in the transactional space and how we move the needle. And so we're going to take this opportunity to just share some of our experiences and our perceptions and some of the work that we do and the work that we've seen done in the space that has moved the needle. So I'll get right into some of our questions, and just open it right up with the sort of standard question, and I'll field that to you, David. What in your sort of own words, and how do you see transactional practitioners contributing and making a difference in sort of driving equity for African Americans?
Thank you, Travis. I'm delighted to join the panel. So I see the role of the transactional practitioner as really in the current environment, a continuation of a history of African-American lawyers who have been in the transactional practice, have not been particularly noted for their accomplishments or achievements in the public realm, but have contributed significantly to whatever growth and development opportunities existed within the African-American community at the time. We're celebrating, I think, this year with some sadness, but also with some sense of pride, the Tulsa Black Wall Street environment. Just think about the kind of legal services that were needed for the African-American entrepreneurs in Tulsa to thrive back in those days. From then up until today, I think the level of recognition has grown, as circumstances have changed. The civil rights movement has changed the legal foundation. And in today's environment, I think more of the African-American lawyers who contribute outside of civil rights and contribute in what can be loosely called the transactional practice are more celebrated. People like the late Johnny Cochran, Vernon Jordan, Eric Holder, and others sort of represent that transactional practitioner, not necessarily focused on civil rights litigation, but making a contribution to the overall effort to gain equality for African Americans within the American context. So I think it's a changing environment. I'm also inclined to think about it broadly, if you want to frame the discussion a bit, that the definition of transaction is to carry out an activity with purpose to conclusion or settlement. So I think in that context, we could say that the civil rights lawyers were actually transactional lawyers as well during their time.
Indeed, I like that. I like that. That's a very good point. Professor Thompson, your thoughts on that same question?
Thank you. Thank you, Travis, for that gracious introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel. And I certainly agree with David's thoughts. And I'll just say that, we do typically think about the need for lawyers to fight for civil rights and in the litigation realm. But one of the most important tools for moving our community forward is building economic wealth and making sure that we have economic justice. And in order to do that, we need to be able to create strong businesses and strong nonprofit organizations that are contributing to the economic wealth of our community. And transactional lawyers are well poised and perfect vehicles to allow that to happen. Any business owner needs to have key strategic legal advice to establish their business and to grow it. Any organization that is trying to do any kind of a deal needs to have a lawyer who is has the resources, has the knowledge to be able to get that deal done successfully. And transactional lawyers are such an important part of that role for developing these businesses and organizations. So, we need to think about equity in a broad way, and we need to think about justice in a broad way. And if we're talking about economic justice, transactional lawyers play a direct role in helping these organizations achieve economic justice.
Wow, excellent. That is great perspective. Thank you for sharing that. Osahan, would you like to add anything in this conversation? I know those two covered quite a few bases.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say again, thank you, Travis, for that really kind introduction. And thank you to my fellow panelists. It's just listening to the two of you speak, I realize how loosely qualified I am to be joining the two of you, but I'll make a go of it here. I'd say, first of all, I remember when I was in law school, I graduated not too long ago in 2017. I was in law school and I went to one of those lunch and learns. And a professor was giving a talk on how the Black lawyer could add to civic life. And the two key examples were become an impact litigator or run for public office. And I had asked this professor, is there anything for people like myself who know we want to go become transactional attorneys? And he said, I'm not sure. And I remember being kind of miffed because I was wondering, am I going to have to either admit to myself that I can't really impact the things that I care about, the causes that are capital C causes for me with my career? Or is it that there's some hidden answer that I haven't yet been able to find? And I started in my practice as a structured finance lawyer, which of course is not necessarily the peak of impacting, Black people or even non-white people on a day-to-day basis, things like that. You can sort of make some academic argument about making products cheaper through securitizations and things like that. But one thing that I've noticed most definitively is that most of my clients have been different funds or large corporations. And what seems to me to be the biggest issue is recognizing the possibility of excellence among people who are Black. And I don't think I've ever worked with a Black client. I don't think I've ever reported to a principal at a client who is Black. But one thing that I've noticed is that over the course of time that I've been working with a lot of my longstanding clients, that not necessarily for my own ability or talent or anything like that, but just my ability to be both a person who is somewhat competent at his job and also be Black, seems to open up a possibility of identifying talent in Black people when they go for their hiring or do their recruiting events and things like that. And this is not the kind of thing that happens in our day-to-day conversations when we're going back and forth on a draft or some red line or something like that. But the conversations we have sort of while we're waiting for documents late at night before a closing and things like that. And you get those kinds of insights where you realize it's not necessarily the case that, I have to own forthright the fact that what I do on a day-to-day basis does not necessarily impact our community in the same direct way that other types of practitioners might. But on the other hand, I do think it is really important as a matter of fundamental representation to show that there are many people, many different types of people who can do this job at a really high level, and show the people who have not necessarily been able to recognize that fact, that maybe the world is bigger than you would have imagined. The world of people who can operate in quote unquote high finance or big law or any of these things is bigger than what you might have imagined. So be a little bit broader in who you think about as your counsel or as your deputy or as your banker, those kinds of things. And I think that's been really interesting to watch. And again, I'm very junior in my career, so I don't necessarily have the same experiences, But that's been what I've observed so far.
Excellent. That is a very, very good perspective. And it's one of the reasons why we diversify our panel in area and profession and experience level. That perspective is sort of the perfect segue for sort of my experience, and that I recognize as well that there's a lot riding on my shoulders in the way I represent myself in representing clients, right? Like when they see me and when they interact with me and when they get work product with me and when they get solutions from me, and they're in that space where quite frankly, there's just not a lot of us represented, whether it be in the boardroom, on the floor in Wall Street, anywhere. If you are a transactional attorney, you may very well be one of the only individuals that they interact with and they're doing it from a professional services standpoint. So you are setting a standard, and maybe you're breaking down some of those misperceptions, right? And that's important because when there are younger people or other folks who are trying to break in that space, you've created a frame of reference that they didn't have, and that moves us forward. And in a lot of ways, like we're celebrating the inauguration of the first Black woman vice president. And that is something that is important in a lot of ways because of what it shows, what it communicates, what people understand that this position can be held and executed in excellence by a person of color, a woman of color. And so I definitely understand what your perspective. It's 100% spot on. And then speaking to that point where you're saying, you don't have a lot of opportunity to represent individuals who are Black. And I think I'm probably, a little bit closer and in the middle, and that what led me to start my own practice after servicing a lot of Wall Street types and not seeing many of us move money and seeing these big paydays and just being real, with people at the table who were not necessarily the most brilliant. There was nothing about them at the table that made me think, wow, you actually warrant a $20 million payday today. That knowing that and realizing that a lot of people in our community don't understand that there's not a lot of difference between you and the people who take home ridiculous money and make amazing strategic business moves, do things like mergers and grow inorganically, and they grow very rapidly and do things like there's not a lot of difference. It's just that somebody might need to be a conduit to help communicate to you that is possible for you. And so that's what made me kind of go out and start my own practice so that I could have more control over transitioning that message and transferring that message to members of the community, people of color. And that's kind of, I've done quite a bit in that space, and we'll talk more, through further in our discussion about sort of how that plays out. And so, one of the things that struck me too, that this topic was important, is every now and then I see individuals who come into my office and they're hiring me and they're somewhere in their trajectory. They're not at the beginning. They've been around 5 years, 10 years. And I'm looking at deals that they've made. I'm looking at strategies that they've deployed. And I'm realizing that they have left thousands, maybe millions of dollars on the table because they didn't necessarily have proper representation. And so that leads me to my question. And that's kind of what drove me to saying, look, we really need to do better in this space. But I'm just curious with respect to you guys, what are some of the worst things that you've seen in terms of poor transactional representation that kind of resulted maybe in exploitation in our community, if at all, in your years? And I'll start with Professor Thompson with this.
This is such a good question, and one that I've been thinking about a lot, because actually in my practice, I primarily represent a lot of startup companies, early stage businesses, early stage organizations. And so a lot of the issues that I've seen is issues with lack of representation. So people, start a company and maybe form a particular entity because somebody, they know who has a business told them to form something and it wasn't the right thing to do. Or somebody filed their own trademark application and they did it the wrong way. And so they came to us in order to fix it. So, one of the issues that I've seen is that obviously, our businesses don't get the representation that they need at an early enough stage. So I think that points to a failure of transactional attorneys being more creative and reaching out to these small businesses and organizations and providing them with either pro bono services if possible, because a lot of them really can't afford those legal services, or somehow thinking creatively and connecting, clinical programs such as the one that I run with firms and with other lawyers who'd be interested in providing these services more comprehensively to these businesses and organizations, so they have the quality and accurate legal services that they need when they're getting established.
So true, so true. Unsung, how about yourself? What have you seen out there?
Yeah,
and it doesn't have to necessarily be one of your clients. I mean, I know as a practitioner, you see things left and right that don't necessarily come across your firm. So just generally speaking, what have you seen out there?
Yeah, I would say the worst was a number of years ago. I worked on a securitization of, I guess, receivables from payday loan companies. And as part of that, we had to read a lot of the underlying agreements and the very onerous terms that were, like, at the time of the securitization were really suspect. And it was very frustrating to me to know that that this business practice was even occurring, and that clearly the majority of the people who were obligors under these initial payday loans didn't have representation, probably weren't in a very good position. And then somewhere, someone was making quite a lot of money off of this. And knowing that those people's interests weren't being represented anywhere. And I know I've heard a lot of the explanation as to why, some people just need very quick access to liquidity and so on. And okay, I hear that. But I feel like there are limits because there are no limits on the upside. So maybe there's just something we could do in the middle. And I think one of the hardest things to deal with, again, in my, very young career, is knowing that oftentimes, there are business practices out there that can be troubling. And if, for example, the client isn't interested necessarily in getting into the details of why it might be questionable, or if the partner isn't necessarily interested in getting to the conversation about why it might be questionable or anything like that, you just have to sort of move on. And that was difficult. And I think those kinds of conflicts are not rare. Let me put it that way. I think, in certain, I guess, different parts of our practices, in a big law context, for example, those kinds of things don't happen too often, but it's often enough. And I think it's important to really think about sort of the big picture of how all the different parts of the economy work together.
Excellent, excellent. How about yourself, David?
Yes, I think comments that have been made are right on point. Thinking what worst experience did I have in my active practice years, I really couldn't come up with anything in specific with respect to a particular client. Although from the perspective of our firm, I know that there has been a variety of areas, real estate and other places, exploitation of the African-American community, which has taken many forms over the decades, including a theft of intellectual property, the form of business ideas, really theft of land through mortgage schemes, even theft of labor at severely below market wages. The thing that I thought about as the worst sort of example of negative impact during my years in the practice had to do with governmental actions, where the lack of political power left the Black community in a position of exploitation. Two things come to mind: is the federal highway system that decimated Black business communities over the years, particularly the case in Detroit, and then the federal government's HUD program for promoting home ownership for families that were below poverty level, which resulted in a great deal of the private forces in the economy in Detroit taking advantage of people who didn't know better, could not afford the mortgages that they signed up to finance their homes, were ultimately foreclosed upon. And thousands of those homes became vacant homes in the city of Detroit and created blight. So this notion of the worst thing has taken a variety of forms over the years. And I think less so these days than in the past, but those experiences still ring in my ears. And one thing that Unsung said that prompted a thought, within his context, because we all exist in a little different context. We have four separate contexts in which we're, quote, transactional practitioners, is that being able to have an impact on the African-American community and bend the arc of justice is a state of mind. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're in the best place to bend that arc, but it does mean that wherever you find yourself, whatever you can do to bend the arc of justice is a contribution, because our society, unfortunately, is ridden with racism that takes so many different forms that fortunately there are a growing number of us who are in a position to see the exact ways and details of how these negative impacts are felt in the African-American community. So fortunately, I think we're a growing cadre of practitioners who can help to assure that justice is realized in the transactional practice.
That part, I am very much. I tell everybody I'm an evangelist. I try to convert litigators to the transactional space so that we do continue to grow. I pluck a few every now and then and change them and put them on our trajectory. And I think the point that you made, the question was, what was the worst thing? And then you were able to rattle off sort of an example, really what shows the systemic impact, right? You're talking about real estate, you're talking about legislative, the lack of voice in government. And that comes from a lack of, honestly, power, wealth, money, right? If you can lobby, if you can pay, you can be at the table. And so some of that is helping businesses develop money, and individuals in our community have better engines for growing wealth so that they can actually participate. We've come to a place in our society where you actually have to pay to have a voice with our government, unfortunately. And I think that is one of the things that's very important about what we do. The more we can facilitate wealth generation and business and transactions, and we can be a voice, I think the better and the more vocal, the more power and influence we can actually have to right things that are wrong. And so, for me, you mentioned theft of intellectual property. I think that actually hit on one of the worst things I saw. And it was an individual who without fully disclosed. They had the original sort of design for something that has now become generic. And, they come to us and they ask us to help them protect it, using any sort of statutory feature, whether it be a patent, trademark, whatever we can shoehorn it in. And ultimately, they are unable to do it because whatever their secret was, it is out in the wild, right? And it is truly a billion-dollar concept that they have receipts on having sort of originated, but they did not know how to properly protect themselves at the onset. And now they are basically spreading that money, and truthfully, with a lot of people that don't look like them, who are exploiting that concept. And it is, I'm talking to a person. This is sort of a family generated thing through years, and that family should be a known family in the world, and they will remain in obscurity. And what they created, they will not get the value of. And many other people didn't come close to creating it or ideating it, because they had better support in wrapping things up, are able to exploit that concept much better. And so that's a common theme. I've seen that more than once. But this particular instance, I just rarely, everybody comes in, they got the next thing, the next piece of sliced bread, and I got to send them away. But this is one thing my firm, we run completely down a rabbit hole. And sure enough, this is something that they had their hands on, and just it slipped away. And by the time they got to us, when we cared enough to even run it down, and I find that being one of the main things. People come to us and they're saying, I talked to a lawyer before, and we didn't have money, and we didn't have the retainer deposit, and most historical institutions that practice law, when it comes to transactional practice, they want the check. They have very little patience for educating individuals who may not have 3 or 4 generations of that experience. And so we fall by the wayside. And so one of the things I like to try to do is be a conduit and use my experience to educate on the opportunities. And with that sort of thought, I'd like to kind of ask each of you individually, whether it be in your practice or leveraging your practice to talk to friends or people in your network who might be endeavoring to establish or utilize business savvy to chase dreams and build for themselves. How have you sort of advanced equity in the community through your skill set, your transactional knowledge? And I'll let you start this one, Unsung.
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. I have been kind of fortunate to have a oddly large circle of friends who have started businesses or been at like the very early stages of things. And, somewhat recently, and I remember even, just having my clinical experience or, being in law school and listening, and then, at the same time getting phone calls from my friends, like, I think I might want to go and do this. I might want to form that or do this. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I don't think that's quite right. And the number of times that's happened where it's like, at the time I'll say, I don't know enough, but I know just this much. And I think you should start going in that direction. And there is, there's a lot to say for having, as you say, just the background level of business savvy and just being able to offer just a small bit of just direction or context to decision-making. A number of my friends and my family own businesses, my parents own businesses and things like that, where since I've sort of started to come along as a lawyer, I can just offer small little tips here and there that can actually make a pretty sizable difference for them and for people like that. And I agree, I think, everybody has made the point in different ways, but just having that level of accessibility for people to come and talk to you about what they do is so critically important. Because as you said, Travis, it may seem in some instances like there's just this corner of the world that just has all of the knowledge and all of the experience and all of the experience with lawyers and things like that, but just being able to kind of explain these things in a more simple way. I think that actually might be the most interesting thing that I've learned since I've started practicing in a more serious way, is that, you know, I have some facility with, I guess, more or less the boardroom language, and I also have facility with kind of my social language. And so it's the ability to explain these things and say, okay, I know this sounds like a very complicated idea, but trust me, everything in finance is fundamentally simple. So let's go talk about it step by step, and you can see why this may be the way to go, or why that may be the thing to do. And then that's just a little bit of information they can use to frame their decision making. It's just being accessible to as many people as possible, and then just saying, hey, I'm not going to be your actual representation, but just offering that level of background understanding of this is how you think about similar problems, rather than this is the solution you should go with in this specific situation.
Oh, that is wonderful. That is so valuable. That exercise that you go through and that effort that you go through is so valuable. And sometimes it's understated, right? Like I tell people all the time, you don't really appreciate a great safety zone because there's no action, right? If you do your job right, as a transactional practitioners, there's no fireworks. And so sometimes you might not appreciate how significant those nudges that kind of turning them a little bit left, a little bit right. You might not ever really appreciate that, but you probably have saved people millions, billions, and help people on the right path, because it's those little things that add up to very significant successes. And then when we do our job right, there's no drama. There's fun and there's celebration. And so I think you say they're little, but they're subtle. I would say subtle, not little. They're subtle things. Subtle things. David, how about yourself?
You know, I agree. That role that Unsung has mentioned is critical, because involved with is not only the knowledge that is passed along to someone who may go in the wrong direction, but also often it involves a referral to a source known to be of quality, someone who can actually help that potential business person achieve the objective. So it's a huge important part. One of the reasons that the growth of our community of transactional practitioners and lawyers in general, even from other areas of practice, are so important in the development of community. From my perspective, with respect to this particular question, I'd have to focus on the fact that with the early partners who formed the firm, our firm is on the threshold of celebrating 50 years in practice. And it's a business, of course, that has sustained those who've been a part of it in terms of having a job, having income, being able to support their families with their spouses, which generates the need for various suppliers and supplier payments, has offered an opportunity through our philanthropy to support local community organizations that are focused on improvement and betterment of the African American community. So it's been a very important contribution. I look back since I graduated from law school and the time I've spent, I feel very gratified that we've been able to make those basic impacts on the lives of those who've been in the firm. We've been, in a larger sense, part of the ecosystem of African American businesses in the communities that we serve. And it's been a joy to be part of that, which has developed over the past several decades to be more robust and more of a contribution to sustaining our communities than has been the case in the past because of discrimination. Feel very gratified in terms of those sorts of involvements that have helped to sustain communities that we live in.
Before I pass it to you, Professor Thompson, I want to put a pin because David, you said that very humbly. I want to put a pin on it, where there's not a big crowd, but that is an applause point. A law firm, 50 years in this space, transactional bond work. The name, Lewis and Monday in Detroit. You know it beyond Detroit. It is as a person who is my firm just turned 11 years in the pride that I have with hiring Black attorneys, paying salaries that people can, achieve their dreams, buy their homes. It pales in comparison to a 50-year track record of circulating dollars in the community, representing excellence in business. The best way I bring it home, I said, if we were fortunate enough somehow to replicate Lewis and Monday at the rate at which other law firms are replicated, how impactful would that be on our community, right? And so what you do by running a successful business, being a successful business owner, because you are both a practitioner in this space, but a business owner who puts money into the pockets of people who look like you. And that is a very big deal. And I've been remiss if we let you just kind of say it 50 years, that's not some, look, there are firms that started before mine and were done within a year or two, and it happens every day. The average business, every business, I don't care who starts it up, is out of business before 5 years, 2-3 years. Law practices trying to be in this space, they're out of business in 2 days. So kudos to you as an example. You are a model in that, and that's very impactful. And I feel very comfortable taking a moment to kind of make that statement as I transition to Professor Thompson, because I am so upset that you didn't set up your clinics before when I was in school. So the impact, I'll let you talk about, generally speaking, but I do know for me, my observation is clear that by creating these transactional clinics, you are transforming the game for us. So I'll let you talk about it, but I don't want you to feel, you don't need to be humble about it. I know, you can give us a little humble brag, share your experience and anything else you want to share.
Thank you. And I just like to echo your sentiments, Travis, to just how, amazing of an accomplishment it is that Lewis and Monday has been in business for 50 years, empowering people in our community and, inspiring other Black lawyers to do the same. And I hope that this inspires our young lawyers in law school to know that this is possible to achieve, because that's something that I wanted to do, and I think it's just so important for our young people to see that it's possible and not that they have to just follow one route. So I just like to say that. I wish I could take credit for starting the community enterprise clinic. Actually, it has been in existence for 30 years. So before I was in law school, it was established. It started out doing something a little different. It was primarily working on affordable housing transactions when it started, and then it has transitioned, I don't want to say transitioned, but it has evolved into a clinic that is more intentionally focused on working with organizations that are doing different types of work to empower Black and Brown people in Detroit in disinvested communities in Detroit and in other urban disinvested areas. So I'm happy that I've been a part of this evolution. I actually have been teaching in this. I started my teaching career teaching in this clinic 15 years ago, 16 years ago. I decided to move from San Francisco to Detroit because I wanted to, be a part of a lot of this energy that I saw happening in the city, and in some way to collaborate with organizations that were working to move the needle forward for people in the community. I was in the clinic for a year. Then I went to Wayne State Law School and started a clinic in Detroit at the law school. And then I came back to Michigan and taught in the clinic for a while, went to the entrepreneurship clinic, started that, and then came back here. And this is really the work that I've wanted to do since I was in high school, because I saw the power of my father's small business and my mother's small business in transforming communities. My father had a small business on the east side of Detroit, and I saw, the impact that it had on his community. So for me, this is a dream to be able to do this work, to have the resources of a Michigan law school, to have very talented students, and to be able to work with organizations and businesses that wouldn't otherwise have access to these resources. And it's important, as Sahan said and David said, that we are educating in the work that we do as transactional attorneys, and providing information in a lot of different formats that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. So not only do we provide direct legal representation, but we also have a blog where we're educating, people about legal issues through that. And we do workshops and we do office hours where we meet with individual entrepreneurs and organizations and talk to them about what they need. And also I advocate in, scholarship about the needs of these businesses. So it really has been just my, life's dream to be able to do this work at the law school, and to be able to nurture this understanding from law students that you can have an impact as a transactional attorney on your community.
Excellent, excellent. And I think the way you close that kind of raises one of my thoughts. I always feel like we have to kind of sell people on how can you help in the transactional space? Osan mentioned when he was inquiring about it, there was almost a cricket's response.
I'm surprised he didn't tell you about the clinic.
And it's funny, I actually took the urban housing, but I think that for me, one of the reasons why this panel was something that I'd like to see talked about was that I sometimes I feel underappreciated as far as the effort that I make and that we make. And maybe it's just me, but I wonder, since I got you here, I'd ask you guys, how do you feel? What are your thoughts? What are your experiences when it comes to the party and the celebration of those who, for the cause and moving the community forward? And you can start that one, Professor Thompson.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the issues is that people don't know what transactional lawyers do. People don't know what transactional lawyering means. In law school, your first year, you're inundated with, having to dissect cases and understand case law. And, in your legal writing class, most of it is litigation oriented. There's very little that's talked about in terms of transactional law or lawyering and what that means. we in the clinic really have to teach our students, this is what it means to be a transactional attorney. You know, in popular culture, you don't see a transactional attorney like in Law and Order or Suits, or, you know, we don't have that representation in popular culture. So, you know, part of it is, you know, it just doesn't seem as sexy to people because, you know, we're not in front of a courtroom, we're not trying to convince a jury of something or a judge of something. And I think we've got to toot our own horn and talk more about the importance of the work that we do. I actually just wrote an article, and it should be published soon in the Journal of Race and Law, that talks about the role of the transactional attorney as a social engineer. And Charles Hamilton Houston, the great, you know, legal mind who, you know, was behind the Brown versus Board of Education and great civil rights cases. He was also a professor of Thurgood Marshall. He talked about the importance of Black lawyers being social engineers. And I agree that we should adopt that role, and transactional attorneys should adopt that role of social engineers and use it in different ways in our practice with, you know, Black small businesses and nonprofits. But we're going to have to be the ones who, you know, put our the importance of the work that we do out there so people know how critical it is for our community. Because if we don't do it, people really don't know what it is, and they won't do it for us.
Well said. Well said. Unsung, what do you think? You feel disrespected like I do?
You know, again, I myself feel properly appreciated. You know, I know that there's so much going on, and again, I have to be very, very real about what I think my own personal impact in this sort of greater story is. But I do think that there is something to be said for, like, yeah, it's probably the case, not probably, it's definitely the case that transactional attorneys are not necessarily like heralded in the same way. And I think, you know, it's interesting to think about the Charles Hamilton Houston example, because he was like, you know, we're social engineers and the way we're going to do this is through like very rigorous prosecution all across the country, and that's great. I've honestly never thought about that example on a transactional side, so that's really, really interesting. I'll be thinking about that, maybe sending you an email after this. But one thing that I find to be really interesting is inserting little bits of just context into the way we think about how we structure our transactions. I know, you know, you had mentioned this in my introduction, but I just sort of was looking at the different ways in which corporate law, just the actual corporate law, has developed in the United States. And one thing that seems to be pretty consistent is we see the continued increase in the availability of upside and the continued decrease in liability of corporate entities over time. And that's really interesting. And that consistently happens in things of like project finance and infrastructure development and things like that. And I wonder why that is. And for someone like myself who does securitization, a lot of those same, I guess, legal technologies that were used to develop, you know, the railroads in the 1820s in New York and so on, are exactly the same types of corporate structure that we use to build our securitizations. And I think it's interesting to note that. What does that say about what we value or what's important to us, and what do we think we as individuals should be responsible for? I think those things are all super important. And I think just to raise the question in, you know, again, in the moments in between, you know, in between deals is really helpful. I like to do that. I like to think about that. It allows me to be more engaged in my work when we're all doing our thing late at night or over the weekends, things like that. But I think my view is that there is a lot of meaning and value in the corporate law that is super important that we don't necessarily think about, because the transaction is what happens at the end of the dispute. And we think of litigators as people coming in at the beginning of a dispute. So if you think about the level of disagreement or conversation that had to happen in order for us to get to the established rules that we have to say this is what an LLC looks like, or what a corporation looks like, or what a leveraged loan should look like, those kinds of things, there are actual conversations about values and morals and politics that came into that are really, really interesting. And a lot of that is extremely relevant to the way that we think about race in this country. And I love thinking about that and having those conversations.
Wow. So it's completely apparent that we stack the deck with the expertise and perspective when we bring a historian on, a professor in the space. And you can, that perspective is unique. And I think it's so important. I don't think I've heard that context communicated like that before. So thank you so much. That was invaluable. David, I'm gonna toss it to you. I know you have never, you get your respect. So I'm just gonna say, over the year, like, have you seen it or ever felt it or just thought that, maybe folks in our space, people could think about more, think about the impact that we have more. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I appreciate the opportunity to comment on this one. I feel respected, and I have a level of self-gratification that got me through a lot of the times when I was not being recognized for maybe contributions that have been made. But I think a couple of things come to mind. Certainly there's quiet recognition of the contributions of lawyers in the community. It's a particular standing that people have when they know that you have graduated law. I think over time, fortunately, there's a greater and growing recognition in the overall community for the accomplishments and achievements of transactional practitioners. And that's a plus, but it's probably not going to be the same as those headline making efforts that will frontally attack certain things that need to be fixed. And that's fine, fine with me. I thought the point that Professor Thompson made about social engineering is so important in this day and age when we talk about systemic racism. And we know how systemic racism is such a broad impact on the advancement of people of color, but particularly African Americans, even to the extent, for instance, that there are African American lawyers, not necessarily transactional lawyers, unless all African American lawyers are transactional lawyers, who are challenging discriminatory algorithms in the tech space. That's an important work. So as society has changed, the opportunities to be a social engineer and really the demands to be a social engineer, these various spaces has continued to grow. But I think as a fundamental proposition, those of us who are in the transactional space should probably not expect to be anywhere near the headline grabbing civil rights attorneys who are cutting new ground. It was some of the cases that are brought that have very broad impact and advance the cause as well.
Spoken like a true hero. Heroes don't seek the spotlight, right? Just go in and get it done and make it move. Appreciate that perspective and that guidance. So we've talked a little bit about the actual importance of transactional practitioners and the work that we do and work that others like us do. So kind of transition and shifting gears on that though, if it's important, do you think, how do you guys feel about the representation of members of the African American community of Black lawyers in transactional practice? Is there enough of us? Do you look around? I always felt like, when I got into the space and I was trying to start my career, it was a fight to get into a capital markets group. And it was very much exclusive territory. And, I had to throw some elbows and really push to get an offer in that particular group. And, I always felt like we are underrepresented. And I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts on that, or what are you guys seeing out there? David, we'll swing it back to you.
Yeah, so as a group, we are vastly underrepresented in the transactional space. Part of the reason for that, or maybe all of the reason, is that those spaces are coveted by the majority and protected because they are the means and an avenue for professional recognition and advancement and wealth creation. And it's not just in the transactional practice, it's all over the various components of American society, including America's universities and colleges and law schools. The opportunity for African Americans and people of color to be invited based on their accomplishments to enjoy some of the benefits that accrue to the higher echelons of American life is legend. Those opportunities are very well protected because they represent everything that is valued in the capitalist system. Economic power, political power, social standing, you name it. As you look at various measures of equality in these various segments of society, whether it's investment management, securities work, international transactions, the representation of our group is minimal, and those barriers still need to be broken down. And I think they are being broken down because there are breakthroughs and trailblazers in these various aspects of the transactional practice. And we fortunately have colleagues who are willing to help break those barriers down, who are not necessarily people of color, but understand that those barriers exist and are willing to open the doors for us that have been open to them. So it's a continuing saga. 50 years ago in Detroit, you could count the number of African-American lawyers on partner track in major firms on one or two hands. That's not the case now, fortunately. It's changed dramatically and to the better. So, but that's the long arc of justice. It's bending in the right direction, but it doesn't bend real fast.
Not at all. Professor Thompson, what are your thoughts on the representation?
Well, David said it beautifully and really covered, the systemic racism that has led to why there are not enough transactional attorneys and really not enough Black attorneys just generally, right? Not enough of us in law school, not enough of us who graduate from law school, who are passing the bar, not enough of us who are at these firms or other organizations or starting our own firms. or staying at firms and becoming partners. But I think that it really, I mean, David just covered it so beautifully, but it is really important, and I'll speak from the law school perspective, that we let law students know that this practice is available and this practice is valuable, and that there are many different things that, they could do with this practice. I think sometimes students come to law school and again, they don't really know what it means to do the work that we do as transactional lawyers. So I think it's important to, like I talk to Black law students and talk about the clinic and talk about the experiences that I had as a transactional attorney so that they understand the work and its importance. So it's going to take a while for this to change, but the more that we can do at every level to provide insights and mentoring and connections, that's only going to improve things.
Gotcha. You guys are sniffing. You're taking away my thunder. I like to look at it like there is transactional attorneys. We're Android, and then you got the iPhone folks, the litigators, and it's one or the other, and we need to be on this side, and that's it, because this is the way to go. But it sounds like your point, and it's very well taken, is that there's just a dearth of us in the first place, and we have to do a better job at pipelining and help, and then battling the barriers that sort of the pipeline, and then maybe we can pick and choose and have more of a pool to sway from. In closing, we're kind of discussing the solutions of how to improve our ranks, and I think to the benefit of the transactional field as well as the profession as a whole. Unsung, you mentioned early on you had some conversation while you were trying to navigate how you could contribute to the community and this space. Just kind of what are your thoughts on what might encourage other young attorneys or young students who might be considering law to go into this space, and how can we work to remove some of the barriers to getting them into this field, this expertise?
Yeah, this is a really hard question. I've been thinking about it a lot. So one thing that's actually been really cool is over the last couple of weeks, it's kind of on-campus interview season right now. And over the last couple of weeks, I've gotten a number of emails from Black Michigan law students, thank you all, who are interested in my firm in Canton, or the firm that I work at Canton. And I think that's really cool. I absolutely love it. And I think to myself, that's one part of the issue is, as we say, getting people in the door. But as I'm sure everybody knows, that one of the core issues is burnout among non-white, especially Black associates in big law. And what's interesting to me is the number is basically the half-life is it's wild compared to other groups. But the issues have been routinely the same, which is not feeling engaged or included in sort of office culture events, not getting quality work, not getting sufficient volume of work and regularity of work, things like that. It's consistently the same. And then also sort of sensibility or sensitivity to or responsiveness to these kind of big picture events that could affect Black people more particularly, but also impact the real world generally. So for example, the riots from, the protests from last summer that a lot of people called riots. And I know that there were a number of times where friends of mine would talk about, like, am I supposed to keep working? Am I supposed to keep doing this? Is this the right time? So I live in Brooklyn. There was just up and down my street, there were just protests going constantly. And I kept thinking to myself, should I be out there? But I know that I have deadlines. I have things that I have to turn in. And I'll reach out to the partners who I'm working with and I'll say, this is something that I feel really strongly about, but I feel very divided on. And I can appreciate at the partner level, that's a hard question to answer. But I think I would encourage people who are comparatively senior in their careers to think about what it must be like for people who are junior in their careers, who don't necessarily have the ability to, for example, say no to things or push deadlines or ask to do things a little bit differently. Just things like that. Like, yes, I very much acknowledge that I'm in a position of extreme privilege to have a big law job and so on. But I also feel like an obligation to participate in, these protests, ideas of Black identity, and in American government generally. So, because the things that we care about, again, forgive my sin of speaking as if we're a monolith, the things that we tend to care about are not always really widely understood or recognized. And so the desire to speak on them or to participate in those events may seem unusual or asymmetrical or those kinds of things. And I feel like it has to happen in sort of a conversation of firm culture that appeals to everybody rather than to the culture that has existed for years and years, because I think we all know that for years and years, a lot of firms have tended to cater to only certain types of people. So I just would ask to continue bringing people in, keep going on the pipeline, but also once people are in, make sure that they see a way for them to meaningfully advance once they're in the door. And think about the things that are important to those people, to us, to people like us, to many different types of people, to everybody, to make them feel like there is a long-term trajectory at the firm that may end in partnership, rather than feeling like you have to flee.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, that's deeper. That's very deep in that. And what I'm hearing is that we have to continue that struggle of you have to succeed yourself and become senior, and then make sure you are setting the table and the stage for those who come behind you in a very thoughtful way, in a consistent way. But you gotta succeed as a senior person to be able to make that commitment. But great share. How about you, Professor Thompson?
So I'm going to pick up on that point that Unsung just made in terms of that sense of isolation, that sense of not actually getting the work that's needed. And I feel like this group, African-American lawyers, alum from Michigan, can provide a source of mentoring and support that students, young lawyers, other lawyers may not be getting from the firms or the organizations that they are in. And if we can provide a support and we can provide guidance and mentoring as people are trying to find their way in these organizations, maybe they won't have somebody that's in the actual firm itself who can help guide them through different things, or maybe they do, but it's important to also get another perspective from seasoned senior attorneys, other attorneys who are alums of the school, and I'm sure would be delighted to provide input and support. This is the work that our group could do in order to support attorneys who are in these firms, and then to also encourage other younger people by coming back to the law school and talking to BALSA students about our practices and talking about how our work is impactful in the Black community. Doing more panels like this, I think it's really important that we have to give back. We have to provide a support and be very purposeful about it, because we know that our young people and other lawyers are not getting that kind of purposeful support. So we have to provide that for each other in order to enhance the representation. And I have to do probably a better job at the law school, just letting, BALSA students know the work that we do, and that transactional work is something that they should consider and could be a very satisfying career for them. I started out at Morrison and Foerster, but I chose the firm because I knew I could do some pro bono work that would be able to have an impact on the Black community. And then I found my way where I am now. So I think that direct impact from us to young people is really key to growing these numbers.
Wow. And I'll say I serve as living proof of what you're saying. And this is a quick commercial for our distinguished alumni. Curtis Mack was not at my law firm, but he is very much a mentor for me. When I came to Atlanta, he actually extended himself to every Michigan alum younger than him, junior than him, and invited us to dinner, to several receptions. He would just gather us and just make himself available. And to this day, one of the reasons why I've been able to continue on this trajectory, when I started my firm, everybody told me you will not be able to have a minority-owned firm that does private equity, mergers and acquisitions, and securities work. You'll change your practice. But I had the support of a Michigan alum who really just committed and poured in. And I am here today doing what I do the way that I want to do it, authentically myself. I like to say that because of that. There is very much proof in what you're saying. I'll let you have the last word on this question, and maybe we'll have a few closing remarks because we're running right up on our time.
Sure. Well, I certainly resonate to the comments that have been made previously. I view our respective cohorts from the law school to be still trailblazers because of the level of inequality in our society, where doors have been closed to people of color, particularly African Americans. Over the years, we're still exploring those trails that lead into academia, lead into large law firms, that lead into our own organizations. And we're exploring how to navigate those areas and achieve the opportunities that are promised through exploring those trails. So we're trailblazers, and we'll be trailblazers until there is true equality for people, regardless of the race that they may be representing. And we need to continue to push forward with respect to everything that we are involved in, with those who are willing to lend a hand and put a shoulder to the wheel to move forward and open those doors, whether it's in the context of a law firm or a university law school, or in other forms, such as expanding the opportunities for law graduates to go to non-traditional areas of the practice, to go to make policy in the federal government or the state government or local government, or go into the tech field and have an impact there. That's how we can have, I think, the maximum impact and continue this struggle that has been waged for so many decades to achieve the true promise of the American dream. So we just individually have to be committed to keep on pushing, find our allies, find out the ins and outs of who's valued, who's not, change that equation, be advocates, and just continue to realize that we have a role in bending that arc of justice.
Wow, I'll let that sink in. Look, I learned we're right up on our time. I learned a long time ago when the thing was said and closed out very well. That's when you let it lay there. Perfect way to close us out. Thank you all. I want to thank the entire panel for your contributions, your insights, your passion about this subject, and for sharing and letting me kind of take us on this journey of this conversation that I think we don't often have or people don't often consider. So thank you for your time. I think that wraps our conversation today, and maybe we'll circle back up and speak some more on some of this.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for leading us, Travis.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.